somewhere in the Kang Group's underground parking structure. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, a 7-year-old girl in a rumpled school uniform stood with her back against a concrete pillar, one hand gripping her mother's phone, the other gripping a small leather ledger she refused to let go of even now. Footsteps echoed somewhere above her, unhurried, deliberate, closing the distance the way a predator closes distance when it already knows there's no rush. "I know you're down here, Ari," a man's voice called out, pleasant and terrible in equal measure. "There's no need to make this difficult. I only want to talk." Ari's thumb hovered over the call button. Her hands, for perhaps the first time in her entire 7 years of relentless composure, were shaking. "If you had told me 4 months ago," she would write later, once this was all over, once the ledger had a proper ending instead of a half-finished sentence, "that I would end up hiding in a parking garage from a man my own grandfather once did business with, I would have told you the odds were statistically negligible. I would have been wrong. I am rarely wrong. I hated being wrong about this one more than almost anything in my life. But that comes later. To understand how a bow tie and a ledger ended up in a concrete stairwell at midnight, you have to go back 4 months, to a morning that started, deceptively, like any other. Part 1. A house without cracks. 6 months into married life, the house Ari had chosen for optimal commute efficiency and school proximity had settled into something that almost looked, from the outside, like an ordinary home. Almost. Mornings ran on Ari's color-coded calendar, taped to the refrigerator in blue ink for school, red for family obligations, and a worrying amount of purple, which Ari refused to explain beyond calling it confidential strategic planning. T.O. had learned to check the fridge before checking his phone. Saren had learned that arguing with a 7-year-old scheduling system was a battle she would never win, and had stopped trying somewhere around March. The business was thriving. Kang Construction's stock had climbed steadily since the restructuring, and T.O.'s decision to formally cut every legacy tie to his grandfather's, less legitimate ventures had turned what industry analysts once whispered about into something they now openly praised. Min-jae, true to his word, had taken over sustainable materials sourcing and had, against everyone's expectations including his own, turned out to be genuinely good at it. He and Ari still exchanged quarterly reports for review, a ritual neither of them would admit had become something closer to friendship. Saren's firm had opened a sole office specifically to accommodate her, and she'd been made partner 3 months after the wedding, a fact Ari had noted in her ledger with the simple, satisfied line, "Confirmed. Correct outcome achieved." Ari herself had started 2nd grade at an international school her grandmother had personally vetted, a decision that came with its own particular chaos, which will matter more later than it seemed to at the time. For now, it was enough that Ari arrived each morning in her small blazer, her hair combed with military precision, her backpack organized by subject in an order she devised herself, and refused to explain to her teachers, who had within the first 2 weeks simply stopped asking. It should have been, by any reasonable measure, a settled kind of happiness. Ari did not trust settled happiness. She had read enough about human psychology and enough about the specific mechanics of large family conglomerates to know that quiet periods in stories like theirs were rarely the ending. They were the part right before something. She said as much to her father one Sunday morning, over pancakes she had insisted on portioning by calorie density. "Things have been suspiciously calm," she said, not looking up from her plate. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation. Calm, in my experience, is rarely permanent. It's usually just the interval between problems." She cut her pancake into precise quarters. "I'd like you to tell me if there's anything currently unresolved from before I was born, business disputes, old family conflicts, anything with the word legacy attached to it, which in my experience is usually code for asterisk unexploded ordnance." T.O. set down his coffee more carefully than the moment strictly required. "Why do you ask?" Because you just did the thing you do when a question makes you uncomfortable. You set your cup down too carefully. Ari finally looked up. What is it? He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something. My father had a life before my mother, before me. There were arrangements back then that families like ours sometimes made and never spoke of again. I don't know all of it. I was a child. But there were years before I was born when my father wasn't the man my mother eventually married. Are you telling me I might have an aunt I don't know about, the same way I once had a father I didn't know about? Saren at the stove went very still. I'm telling you, T.O. said carefully, that I don't know. I've never had reason to look. My father buried a great many things well, and most of them stayed buried. Ari considered this with the same unhurried focus she gave everything. I'd like to look if it's all right with you, quietly. I don't like unexploded ordnance sitting in a house I live in. Ari, that's not a job for a 7-year-old, Saren said. It's not a job for anyone technically since nobody's asked me to do it. I'm doing it as a personal research project, like a book report. Ari went back to her pancakes, entirely unbothered. I'll let you know if I find anything alarming. Neither of her parents took the comment as seriously as they should have. That was, as it turned out, a mistake, because 3 weeks later, a woman walked into the Kang Group's main lobby claiming to be Kang T.O.'s older half-sister, and the calm Ari had been so suspicious of came apart in a single afternoon. Part 2, the woman from nowhere. Her name was Han Soo-jin. She was 39, immaculately dressed, and carried herself with the particular composure of someone who had spent a long time rehearsing exactly this entrance. She did not go through reception. She walked directly to the executive floor, informed the stunned assistant at the desk that she had an appointment, and was already seated in T.O.'s office by the time security caught up with the story. You have 5 minutes, T.O. said, standing behind his desk rather than sitting, before I have you escorted out and my lawyers contact whoever put you up to this. No one put me up to this, Soo-jin said calmly. I put myself up to it. 39 years too late, some might say. I don't know you. No, you wouldn't. Your father made very sure of that. She set a manila folder on his desk without being asked. My mother worked in your father's household in the years before he married yours. She left when she was 3 months pregnant with a settlement, a signed non-disclosure agreement, and strict instructions never to use the Kang name for anything ever, under any circumstances. Her composure cracked just slightly around the edges. I've spent 39 years using my mother's maiden name because a piece of paper told me to. I'd like that to stop. T.O. opened the folder. Photographs, decades old, his father, younger, unmistakable, standing beside a woman T.O. had never seen in his life. A hospital birth record. A settlement agreement with his father's signature, dense with legal language designed to make a person disappear cleanly. This could be forged. It could be. I'd welcome a DNA test to settle that immediately, actually. I've brought the paperwork for one already in case you're the sort of man who needs to see results before he believes anything. She met his eyes. I'm not here for money if that's your next assumption. I have plenty. I run 3 restaurants and a small hospitality group, and I built every part of it myself, without your family's name attached to a single brick of it. I'm here because I recently read about a 7-year-old girl who apparently walked into this family and was welcomed with open arms, DNA test and all, and I found myself asking why my mother and I were never given the same courtesy. The words landed exactly as precisely as she'd intended them to. I read about your daughter, Soo-jin continued, quieter now. The bow tie, the ledger. The whole story made the business press, heir's secret daughter welcomed into the family. Charming. I thought, how nice for her. And then I thought about my own mother dying alone in a small apartment 11 years ago. Still afraid to say the word Kang out loud because a piece of paper had trained her to be afraid of it for 30 years. And I decided I was done being quiet about it. T.O. sat down slowly, the folder heavy in his hands. What do you want? Acknowledgement. My name on paper as what I actually am. She stood. And since we're being honest, a seat at whatever table decides who this family recognizes and who it doesn't. Because from where I'm standing, your father built an entire system for making inconvenient people disappear, and it looks like you're the one currently benefiting from every part of it he didn't manage to erase. She left the folder on his desk and walked out, and T.O. sat alone in his office for a long time afterward, staring at a photograph of his father with a woman he'd never known existed, feeling the ground shift beneath him for the second time in 2 years. He did not tell Saren that night. He told himself it was because he needed to verify things first, needed lawyers and DNA labs and certainty before he brought this into their home. He told himself several things, all of them reasonable, all of them wrong in exactly the way his silence 8 years ago had once been wrong. Ari, of course, noticed within 20 minutes of him walking through the door. "You're doing the careful cup thing again," she said over dinner. "Worse than before." "I'm fine, sweetheart." "You've said that exact sentence 4 times tonight. I've been counting." She set down her chopsticks. "Something happened at work today. I'd like to know what, before I have to find out the way I usually find out things, which is to say, by accident at the worst possible moment." T.O. looked at his daughter, 7 years old, watching him with an expression that was equal parts patience and warning, and understood, with sudden clarity, that hiding things from the women in this house had never once worked out well for him. "I might have a half-sister," he said. "I found out about it today." Ari absorbed this with the same steady focus she brought to everything. "Is she planning to hurt you, or Mom, or me?" "I don't know yet." "Then I'd like the folder she gave you, please. I'll review it tonight." Ari held out her hand. "You clearly don't know what to do with information like this." "I do. It's practically my area of expertise at this point." Saren, across the table, let out a small, disbelieving laugh, half exhaustion, half something that was almost fondness, the specific flavor of emotion reserved entirely for their daughter. "We are never, ever going to have a normal family crisis, are we?" "Statistically," Ari said, already reaching for the folder T.O. reluctantly slid across the table, "no, we are not." Part 3, What the Ledger Found. Ari spent 3 nights with the folder spread across her bedroom floor, alongside printouts she'd requested from her father's legal team, public filings, old newspaper archives, hospitality industry press about Han Soo-jin's restaurant group, and most tellingly, a set of financial records T.O. hadn't even known his daughter had the access or the nerve to request. On the 4th night, she called a family meeting. She used those exact words, family meeting, standing at the head of the dining table with a small stack of index cards, while her parents exchanged the particular look of people who had stopped being surprised by their daughter's methods months ago. "Findings," Ari announced, "in 3 parts." "Ari, you didn't need to make slides for this." "I don't have slides. I have index cards. Please don't interrupt my presentation." She cleared her throat. Part 1. Han Soo-jin's claim appears to be genuine. The settlement paperwork matches your grandfather's known signature and the legal firm he used for 2 other unrelated matters during that same decade. I'd still recommend the DNA test, but I don't believe she's lying. T.O. nodded slowly, agreed. Part 2. Her financial situation. She's telling the truth about not needing money. Her restaurant group turned a healthy profit last year, verified through public filings. She is not doing this for a payout. Ari set that card down. Which means her stated motive, recognition, and a seat at the table is probably the real one. People rarely lie convincingly about wanting something that doesn't obviously benefit them financially. "And part 3, Saren asked. Ari's expression shifted just slightly into something more careful. "Part 3 is the concerning part. Someone leaked her existence to a business journalist 3 days before she walked into Dad's office. Not after, before. which means someone knew about her and about the timing of her visit in advance and made sure the story would already be half written the moment she made her move. She slid the final card across the table. I traced the leak. It came from an email account registered to a shell company. That shell company has filed 3 joint ventures over the past 2 years with Beek Industrial Group. The name landed in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. Beek Industrial Group was Kang Construction's largest domestic rival, a company that had spent the better part of a decade trying, and consistently failing, to break into the waterfront development contracts Kang Group had quietly dominated for 2 generations. Their chairman, Baek Joon-ho, had made no secret, in interviews and shareholder calls alike, of his ambition to see the Kang name diminished by any means available to him. "You're telling me Beek Group found her first," T.O. said slowly, "and helped stage this." "I'm telling you the timing is suspicious enough to investigate further. I'm not telling you Han Soo-jin knows she's being used, if she is being used at all. It's entirely possible she's a genuine woman with a genuine grievance who happened to attract the attention of people looking for a lever to use against this family. Those 2 things aren't mutually exclusive." Ari folded her hands. "My recommendation is that we treat her claim as legitimate and handle it with fairness, because it probably is legitimate, and because treating her badly is exactly the kind of thing Beek Group would want, to prove this family repeats its old patterns. But we also need to find out exactly what Beek Group intends to do with this, before they do it." Saren looked at her daughter for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. "You did all of this in 3 days." "4 technically. I stayed up late on the 3rd one," Ari shrugged. "I told you calm doesn't usually last. I don't love being right about things like this." T.O. reached over and squeezed his daughter's shoulder. "I'm going to call Soo-jin tomorrow. Arrange the DNA test and a proper meeting, one where we actually listen to her, instead of one where she has to break into my office to be heard." "Good," Ari said. "And Dad, when you meet with her, bring me." "Ari, this is an adult conversation." "It's a conversation about family," Ari said simply. "And I am, apparently, this family's foremost expert on being an inconvenient relative nobody knew about who turned out fine in the end. I think I have something useful to offer her. If nothing else, I can tell her what it felt like on my side of a very similar door." Neither parent had an argument for that. Part 4, the meeting. Han Soo-jin arrived at the Kang estate expecting, by her own later admission, a fight. What she found instead was a 7-year-old girl in a small charcoal blazer, standing at the door with a clipboard, who greeted her with a formal bow. "Ms. Han, I'm Ari. I understand you might be my aunt." Soo-jin blinked, visibly thrown. "You're the daughter, the one from the article." "I prefer the daughter with the bow tie, but yes." Ari stepped aside to let her in. "I did some research on you this week. 3 restaurants, all profitable, all built without a single Kang-adjacent investment. I'm impressed, actually. Most people who show up here are trying to get something from this family. You built something before you ever walked in the door." Something in Soo-jin's composure wavered for the first time since she'd arrived. That's an unusual thing for a child to notice. "I notice a lot of things. It's mostly a curse." Ari led her toward the sitting room where T.O. and Saren waited, along with a lab technician for the DNA swab Soo-jin had requested herself. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're lying about who you are. I think you're probably telling the truth, and I think this family owes you an actual conversation instead of a lawsuit. I told my father as much." "You told him that?" "I tell him most things. He's slowly getting used to it." The DNA test took 30 seconds and a swab. The results would take 2 days, though everyone in the room already suspected what they'd show. What took longer and mattered more was the conversation that followed, 3 hours of it, over tea that went cold twice, in which Soo-jin finally said out loud everything she'd spent 39 years rehearsing only in private. "My mother never remarried. she told them. Never dated again as far as I know. She worked 2 jobs and raised me in a one-room apartment above a laundromat, and every single month, like clockwork, a payment arrived from an account with no name attached to it, enough to keep us fed, never enough to ask questions about, and always, always with a note. The same note every time. Do not contact this family. Her hands tightened around her teacup. I used to think it was your father's guilt money. I've since decided it was something closer to fear. He was afraid of what I represented, I think. Not me, specifically. What I proved about him. I'm sorry, T.O. said quietly. For whatever that's worth, coming from someone who only just learned you existed. It's worth something. Sujin studied him. You don't look much like him. I always wondered if I would when I finally saw you in person. I don't particularly either. Maybe that's for the best. What was she like? Ari asked, more gently than she'd asked anything all afternoon. Your mother. Sujin looked at her, surprised by the question, and something in her face softened. Stubborn, she said slowly. Funny, in a dry way most people missed. She used to say the laundromat customers were the best free entertainment in the city if you paid attention to how they folded their own shirts. A small, private smile. She never once told me to be angry at your family, you know. She just told me to be careful. I think I mistook careful for ashamed for most of my life. I don't think that's actually what it was. It sounds like she was protecting you, Ari said. The same way my mom protected me. People who love us don't always explain the shape their love takes. Sometimes you just have to trust that it was love, even when it looked like fear from the outside. Sujin's eyes went bright and wet, entirely unexpected. You are a very unsettling child. I've been told. Ari, who had been listening with unusual quiet for the better part of an hour, finally spoke again. I have one more question, if that's all right. Of course. When you found out about me, about my mom and me being welcomed here, how did that actually make you feel? Not the version you gave my father in his office. The real version. Sujin looked at her for a long moment, surprised by the directness, and then slowly answered honestly. Furious, she admitted. And then ashamed of being furious at a child I'd never met who didn't choose any of this any more than I did. And underneath both of those things, hopeful, I think. If this family could do it once for you, maybe it could do it again. For me. That's fair, Ari said. I'd probably feel the same way in your position. She considered something further. I want to be honest with you about something else, too. Someone leaked the story about you to the press before you ever walked into my father's office. We traced it to a company connected to Beek Industrial Group. I don't think you knew that when you decided to come forward, but I think you should know it now, because it changes what your visit here actually means to some people. Sujin went very still. I didn't know that. I believe you. But it matters. Because if Beek Group is trying to use your very real, very legitimate grievance to destabilize this family from the inside, then the honest thing you're doing and the dishonest thing they're doing are about to get tangled up together, whether you want them to or not. I thought you deserved to know that before it happens to you the way it already happened to us once. There was a long silence. Then Sujin let out a breath that seemed to carry 39 years of tension with it. You really are as sharp as the article said. Sharper usually. The article undersold me. For the first time since she'd arrived, Sujin laughed, surprised out of her genuine. I can see why they let you sit in on this. By the time she left that evening, nothing had been formally resolved. The DNA results were still 2 days out. The legal recognition still unsettled. The question of what role, if any, she'd play in the family's business still entirely open. But something had shifted in the room, quietly and permanently, in a way that mattered more than any single document could have. She's telling the truth, Ari said, once the door had closed behind their guest. About who she is and about not being part of whatever Beek Group is planning. I'd bet my entire allowance on it. I believe you, T.O. said. But that means Beek Group is still out there, using her situation as a lever, whether she wants them to or not. Yes, Ari agreed. which means the real problem hasn't even introduced itself to us yet. Ms. Han was never the threat. She's just the crack somebody else found first. Part 5. New Uniform, Old Rivalries. While the adults untangled the mess of paperwork and press statements, Ari's own world had quietly gained a complication of its own, one that would matter more than anyone realized at the time. Her second-grade class at Seoul International Academy was small, competitive, and populated almost entirely by the children of Seoul's business elite, which meant Ari spent her first month there conducting what she privately termed a threat assessment of the social landscape. Most of it bored her. Most 7-year-olds, she'd concluded early on, were not interested in efficient conversation. One classmate, however, drew her attention almost immediately. A boy named Baek Jae-hoon, quiet, watchful, sharp in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of herself. He sat 2 rows over, said very little, and had, on the second day of school, corrected the teacher's explanation of compound interest with a precision that made Ari look up from her own notebook in genuine surprise. It was 3 weeks before she learned his last name meant anything. Baek, she repeated slowly, testing the syllable, the day a school newsletter listed parent names for the upcoming fundraising gala. As in Baek Industrial Group. My father runs it, Jae-hoon said, without looking up from his own work. I assume that means something to you, given who your family is. It means several things, actually, most of them concerning. Ari studied him. Does he know we're in the same class? He knows everything about everyone who might eventually be useful to him, Jae-hoon said, and there was something in his voice, not malice, exactly, but a kind of weary resignation that made Ari reconsider her first assessment of him entirely. I wouldn't take it personally. He's not especially interested in me either, most days, just in what I might become useful for. Ari sat with that for a long moment. That sounds lonely. It's efficient, Jae-hoon said, though something in his jaw tightened when he said it, and Ari, who had spent her whole life being fluent in exactly this kind of careful deflection, recognized it immediately for what it was. They did not become friends immediately. Ari was too cautious for that, and Jae-hoon too guarded. But over the following weeks, in the careful, incremental way 2 unusually observant children sometimes find each other, something like an alliance began to form, traded notes on a shared interest in chess, a quiet debate over a mathematics competition problem, an unspoken agreement not to mention either of their father's business dealings at school, where neither of them had asked to inherit a war. It was Jae-hoon, in the end, who gave Ari her first real warning. My father's been on the phone a lot, he told her one afternoon quietly while they worked through a puzzle set during free period. More than usual, angry calls. I heard your family's name twice this week. He didn't look up from the puzzle. I don't know what he's planning. I wanted you to know that I'm not part of whatever it is, in case that matters. It matters, Ari said, equally quiet, equally careful not to draw attention. Thank you for telling me. You should be careful, Jae-hoon added, so quietly she almost missed it. My father doesn't lose well. I've never once seen him lose well. Ari filed that warning away in her ledger that night, under a new heading she titled simply, Jae-hoon, reliable, cautious, worth trusting further. She did not yet know how much that particular friendship would matter before this was over. She only knew, with the same instinct that had never once failed her, that the calm around her family was about to end again, and this time, the ending had a name and a face 2 rows over in her own classroom. Part 6. The crack widens. The DNA results confirmed what everyone had already suspected. Han Soo-jin was, unambiguously, Kang Tio's half-sister, a fact Tio acknowledged publicly within the week in a short, carefully worded statement that named her, welcomed her, and made no mention whatsoever of any role in the company, a boundary Soo-jin herself had insisted on. I don't want the business, she told him plainly. I have one. I want my name to stop being something my mother had to whisper, that's all. It should have ended there cleanly. It did not. 3 weeks after the public acknowledgement, an emergency session of the Kang Group Family Council was called, not by T.O., but by two board members whose names, when Ari cross-referenced them against public shareholder filings, turned out to hold minority stakes in a subsidiary recently acquired by, unsurprisingly, Beek Industrial Group. The agenda item, when it finally arrived in writing, was almost elegant in its cruelty. A formal motion to review the legitimacy and succession implications of recent revelations within the Kang family. Specifically, whether a chairman who had concealed one illegitimate child for 7 years and only recently discovered a second, undisclosed half-sibling of his own, possessed the family transparency and governance standing required to remain chairman without a formal confidence vote. "They're not trying to remove me over Soo-jin," T.O. said grimly, reading the motion at the kitchen table while Ari read over his shoulder, uninvited and entirely undeterred by that fact. "They're using her and Ari together to build a story about instability, a pattern of concealment. It's not about whether either of you belongs in this family. It's about making the board nervous enough to vote me out." "And Beek Group would very much like a nervous board," Ari said, "because a chairman fighting a confidence vote is a distracted chairman, and a distracted chairman loses waterfront contracts to a hungrier competitor." "Exactly." Saren had gone very quiet, watching her husband's face carefully. "How serious is a confidence vote? Actually serious?" "Serious enough that I need to prepare for it like my career depends on it," T.O. admitted. "Because it does." Ari set down her spoon with the particular deliberateness she reserved for moments that mattered. "Then we prepare properly. All of us. I have some thoughts, if anyone's interested in an outside perspective from someone who is, technically, part of the reason this vote is happening." "Ari, you're 7. This isn't something you should have to fix." "I'm not fixing it because I have to," Ari said. "I'm fixing it because I'm good at exactly this kind of problem, and because I refuse to sit in my room doing homework while people try to use my existence as a weapon against my own father. That's not a sacrifice, Mom. That's just strategy." She was already reaching for a fresh notebook page. "First," she said, "we need to know exactly which board members are wavering and why. Second, we need Aunt Soo-jin's public support, genuine support, not a staged photo, because the board will smell a staged photo from a mile away. Third," she paused, tapping her pen against the table, "we need to find out exactly what Beek Group actually wants out of a distracted Kang Group, because that tells us where they'll strike next, and I'd rather know that before it happens instead of after." T.O. looked at his daughter for a long moment. 7 years old, already assembling a counter-strategy against a hostile takeover attempt, with more composure than most of his executive team could manage. "You know," he said slowly, "there's a version of this family's future where you run this company someday, and Min-jae handles operations, and none of Beek Group's grandchildren ever managed to lay a single hand on it." "I know," Ari said, entirely without arrogance. "I've thought about it, but that's a long-term plan. Right now, we have a board vote in 3 weeks, and I'd like to actually sleep at some point before then, so let's move quickly." Part 7, the board vote. The 3 weeks that followed were the busiest of Ari's short life, though she would later insist, with characteristic precision, that busy undersold the experience considerably. She sat in on strategy meetings her father's lawyers initially objected to, until it became clear that her questions were sharper than most of theirs. She spent 2 full weekends cross-referencing the voting histories of every board member against their business ties, building a spreadsheet T.O.'s chief of staff later admitted, privately, was more thorough than the one his own team had produced. She wrote Han Soo-jin a letter, a real one handwritten, not dictated by any adult, asking plainly whether she'd be willing to stand publicly beside the family she'd only just found, even though nobody could promise her anything in return for doing so. Soo-jin's answer arrived 2 days later in the form of her showing up at the estate unannounced, sleeves rolled up, ready to help. "Nobody has ever asked me to stand beside this family for nothing before," she told Ari. "Every single interaction I've ever imagined having with the Kangs involved someone wanting something from me, or me wanting something from them. You just asked if I'd help because it was the right thing to do." She shook her head, something soft crossing her face. "I've decided I like being asked that way. So yes, I'm in." The night before the vote, Ari couldn't sleep. Saren found her at midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with her ledger open, staring at a page covered in crossed-out strategy notes. "You should be asleep, sweetheart." "I know, I can't stop running scenarios." Ari didn't look up. "What if it's not enough? What if we've done everything right and it still isn't enough, and Dad loses the company he spent 3 years cleaning up to people who never once tried to make anything better?" Saren sat down beside her daughter, really sat, the way she rarely got to anymore, and pulled Ari into her side the way she used to when Ari was small enough to still fit easily into a hug like that. "Then we survive it," Saren said quietly, "the same way we survived everything before this, together and honestly and without pretending it doesn't hurt when it does." She kissed the top of Ari's head. "You've done everything a 7-year-old could possibly do, and considerably more than most adults would manage. Whatever happens tomorrow isn't a reflection of whether you tried hard enough. It never was." Ari leaned into her mother for a long, quiet moment, 7 years old again. Instead of a strategist, instead of a ledger keeper, instead of anything but a child who was frightened for her family. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, baby, more than any spreadsheet could ever measure." The board convened the next morning in a room lined with portraits of Kang chairmen going back 3 generations. T.O. stood at the head of the table, Saren beside him, Soo-jin, introduced formally, for the first time, as family standing just behind them, and Ari permitted to attend as an observer after considerable lobbying on her own behalf, sitting quietly in the corner with her notebook. The 2 board members who'd called the vote made their case first, practiced, careful, dressed up as concern for governance standards rather than what it actually was. Then T.O. spoke, plainly, about the restructuring he'd completed, the transparency he'd built, the family he'd chosen to acknowledge rather than hide, twice now, at real personal cost. It was Soo-jin who turned the room. "I spent 39 years being the Kang family's best-kept secret," she told the board, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "My mother spent 30 years afraid to say a name out loud. If you're looking for evidence of concealment in this family, you're 30 years too late. That concealment already happened, under the last chairman, the one this board apparently has no concerns about in hindsight. What you're actually voting on today is whether a man who broke that pattern, who found his daughter and welcomed her, who found me and welcomed me too, without hesitation, without a payout, without a single non-disclosure agreement, whether that man should be punished for being more honest than his father ever was." She looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one. "I'd think very carefully about what precedent you're setting, and who exactly benefits from setting it." The vote, when it finally came, was not close, 22-4 in T.O.'s favor. Ari, from her corner, allowed herself exactly one small, satisfied smile before returning her attention to her notebook, where she wrote in careful handwriting, "Confidence vote passed. Threat contained, not eliminated. Beak Group's actual objective remains unclear. Continued monitoring recommended." She would be proven right, within the month, about exactly how much of the danger still remained. Part 8. What Ari overheard. It happened, as these things so often did in this family, at a party. The Kang Group's annual gala was a fixture of Seoul's business calendar, a night of careful smiles and careful alliances dressed up as celebration. Ari, permitted to attend for the first hour before being sent home with her grandmother, had wandered away from the small cluster of adults orbiting her parents, drawn, as she always was, toward the quiet corners where honest conversations happened instead of performed ones. She found Baek Jun-ho's assistant near the terrace doors, phone pressed to his ear, voice pitched low enough that he clearly believed himself alone. Vote didn't work, so we moved to phase 2, he was saying. The Ilson waterfront contract renewal is up in 8 weeks. If we can get even one of Kang's minority partners to defect before then, the whole project stalls, and stalled projects make investors nervous regardless of what the board thinks of the chairman personally. A pause. No, the sister thing didn't land the way we wanted. The board sided with sympathy instead of scandal. We need something harder to spin as sympathetic. Another pause, longer this time. The kid, then. Not directly, obviously not directly. We're not animals. But if there's a custody angle, an old paperwork issue from before the marriage, anything that raises a question about whether the mother's claim to the child is even fully legal in this country, that's not a scandal about generosity. That's a scandal about legitimacy. That's harder to survive. Ari stood perfectly still behind the potted plant she drifted near, her small hands curling slowly into fists at her sides. The man ended his call a moment later and walked back into the party, entirely unaware that a 7-year-old girl in a miniature blazer had just heard, in plain terms, that she herself was about to become the next weapon aimed at her family. She did not cry, she did not panic. She walked with deliberate calm to find her father, and when she reached him, she took his hand and said, quietly, so only he could hear, "We need to leave. Now. I have something to tell you that cannot wait until morning." Part 9, Old Paperwork. What Ari had overheard sent T.O.'s legal team scrambling that same night, and what they found, by early the next morning, turned Ari's stomach in a way strategy spreadsheets never had. Saran and T.O.'s marriage had been registered in Seoul, straightforward and legal in every respect. But Ari's birth, 7 years earlier, in a Vancouver hospital, to a mother who had, at the time, been living under circumstances of genuine, careful secrecy, had been registered with a minor clerical inconsistency. Saran's name on the Canadian birth certificate did not perfectly match the name on her original Korean identification, a discrepancy dating back to a rushed, anxious visa renewal Young-hee had arranged years before Ari was born, back when erasing every trace of their old life had felt like the only way to survive. It was nothing, legally, in any court that looked at it honestly, a paperwork mismatch easily explained and easily corrected, the kind of small bureaucratic wrinkle immigration lawyers untangled every week. But Beak Group's people weren't interested in an honest court. They were interested in a headline. Kang Air's daughter's legal parentage called into question amid inconsistent international records. 3 sentences designed to do exactly one thing, which was make every partner on the Ilson contract nervous enough to ask questions before signing. "They're going to use this to make it look like I'm not really your child," Ari said, sitting very still at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, the first time in the entire ordeal that her composure had genuinely, visibly cracked. Not legally, not for real, just enough to make a headline, enough to make people wonder. "It won't work," Saran said fiercely, pulling her daughter close. "It's a clerical error, Ari, nothing more. Any lawyer, any judge, anyone with 2 working eyes can see that." "I know it won't work legally," Ari said, her voice smaller than either parent had heard it in a long time. "But it will still happen. People will still read the headline even after it's corrected. Even after the correction, some people will just remember the version where there was a question mark next to my name." She looked up at her mother, and for the first time in this entire long ordeal, she sounded exactly like the child she still, underneath everything, was. "I don't want people to have a question mark next to whether I'm really yours, Mom. I've spent my whole life being sure of that. I don't want anyone else to get to doubt it, even for a headline." Saran's eyes filled with tears. "You are mine," she said fiercely, cupping her daughter's face in both hands. "You have been mine since the moment I felt you, Ari. No clerical error, no headline, no man on a phone at a party gets to put a question mark on that. Not ever. Do you understand me?" "I understand it logically," Ari said, tears finally, quietly slipping free. I'm having a harder time understanding it emotionally right now. That's allowed, T.O. said, kneeling in front of his daughter, his own voice rough. You're allowed to be 7 sometimes, even in the middle of all of this. You don't have to be the strategist every single hour of every single day. Let us carry this one, just this once. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Ari let them. Part 10, the warning. The correction to Ari's paperwork was filed the next morning, a clean, fully documented process that closed the gap entirely. But paperwork, as Ari herself had predicted, was never the real danger. The real danger arrived 4 days later, in the form of a note passed to her during morning recess by a boy who looked more frightened than she had ever seen him. My father knows the paperwork story didn't land, Jae-hoon said quietly, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hand before anyone could notice. I heard him on the phone again last night. He said something about making it personal if the professional angles keep failing. I don't think he means it the way it sounds, but I don't actually know that. I wanted you to have this before anything happens, in case anything happens. Ari unfolded the paper once she was alone. It was a printed schedule, her own school pickup schedule, along with notes on which days her family's driver ran late, and which days she walked the short distance to the parking structure alone while waiting for him. Her blood ran cold in a way no boardroom motion or planted headline had ever managed. She did not go to her parents immediately. She sat with it first, the way she sat with everything, turning the paper over in her hands, trying to decide whether this was a genuine threat or the kind of aggressive intimidation tactic meant only to frighten, never to act. She could not, for the first time in months, arrive at a confident answer. That uncertainty was, in the end, exactly what put her in the parking structure 4 days later. Not because she'd been careless, but because her family's driver, running 15 minutes behind after an unrelated traffic accident across town, had texted the school office instead of Ari's phone directly. And Ari, following her ordinary routine, had walked down to the usual pickup spot to wait, exactly as the schedule Jae-hoon had warned her about predicted she would. She was halfway across the underground structure when she heard the footsteps behind her, unhurried, deliberate, closing the distance the way a predator closes distance when it already knows there's no rush. I know you're down here, Ari, a man's voice called out, pleasant and terrible in equal measure. There's no need to make this difficult. I only want to talk. It was Baek Jun-ho himself. Part 11, the parking structure. Ari ducked behind a concrete pillar, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with being, in this single moment, exactly what she actually was. A 7-year-old child, alone, in an underground parking structure, with a grown man who had already proven he was willing to use children as leverage walking toward her with slow, patient steps. Her hands shook as she pulled out her mother's spare phone, the one Saren insisted she carry for emergencies, the one Ari had always privately considered an excessive precaution. She was no longer sure it was excessive. You've caused my company a great deal of trouble, Baek Jun-ho continued, his voice echoing off the concrete, still pleasant, still deliberate. A 7-year-old tracing shell companies, cross-referencing board voting records. Do you know how unusual that is? I confess I underestimated you. I don't intend to make that mistake twice. Ari's thumb found the call button. She pressed it and held the phone against her chest, muffling the sound, praying it connected before her voice would be needed to explain anything. I'm not going to hurt you, Baek Jun-ho said, closer now, his footsteps slowing as he rounded the pillar she ducked behind. I want to be very clear about that. I am whatever your family believes of me, not a monster. I simply want your father to understand clearly and personally that this fight costs more than board votes and headlines. I want him to feel, the way I've felt for years, watching his family's name dominate contracts mine built the foundations for. You want him scared, Ari said, stepping out from behind the pillar, her voice shaking but her spine straight, because if there was one thing 7 years of being underestimated had taught her, it was that showing fear rarely helped and never once solved anything. You've spent months trying every angle that doesn't involve actually building something better than what my family already has. That's not strategy. That's just resentment with a company attached to it. Something flickered in Baek Joon-ho's expression, surprise, and beneath it, something colder. You're braver than you should be, given the circumstances. I'm not brave. I'm stalling, Ari said honestly, because lying to him would accomplish nothing and the truth, at least, might buy her the second she needed. The phone in my hand is already connected to my mother. She's already heard everything you've said. So as whoever picks up security dispatch, because I called this building's emergency line first, not her personal number, and you've been standing under a camera for the entire time you've been talking to me. It was, in fact, entirely true, and it was the single most important piece of strategic thinking Ari had done in her entire 7 years of strategic thinking, because within 90 seconds, the stairwell door banged open, and two of the building's security officers arrived at a dead run, radios crackling, flashlights sweeping the garage, drawn not by Ari's call, which had barely connected, but by an anonymous tip phoned in 11 minutes earlier by a worried 12-year-old boy who had, after hours of agonizing over what his father might actually do, finally called the one number he could think of that wasn't his own home. Baek Joon-ho was gone before security reached the pillar, slipping calmly, unhurriedly, toward a service exit, the picture of a man who had simply been passing through and paused to speak with a lost child. But the security footage caught enough. His face, his voice on Ari's still-connected call, and most damning of all, Jae-hoon's own frantic tip, time-stamped on record, matching everything Ari would go on to describe. T.O. arrived 11 minutes after that, having broken every reasonable speed law in Seoul, and found his daughter sitting on a concrete step with a security guard's jacket around her shoulders, pale, shaking, but entirely, miraculously unhurt. He didn't say anything at first. He simply crossed the garage in 6 long strides and pulled her into his arms so tightly she made a small, surprised sound. "I'm all right," Ari said into his shoulder, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. "I'm all right, Dad. I was scared. I was really, really scared, but I'm all right." "I know," he said, his voice breaking entirely open. "I know, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you were scared, and I'm so sorry it took me 11 minutes to get to you." He pulled back just enough to look at her face, checking over and over that she truly was unharmed. "You are never walking to a pickup spot alone again. Not once. Not ever." "I won't argue with that," Ari said, and for the first time since the man's footsteps had first echoed toward her, she let herself cry, not composed tears, not strategic tears, just the raw, frightened tears of a child who had been very brave for exactly as long as she needed to be, and no longer had to be brave now that her father's arms were around her. Part 12, The Reckoning. What happened next moved faster than even Ari, with all her spreadsheets and index cards, could have engineered. The security footage, combined with Jae-hoon's recorded tip and Ari's own account, gave T.O.'s legal team more than enough to pursue charges: intimidation of a minor, criminal harassment, and a mountain of supporting evidence tying Baek Joon-ho's company to the shell accounts, the leaked story, and months of coordinated pressure against the Kang family. Baek Joon-ho's lawyers moved to settle quietly within days, terrified of what a public trial would do to a company already reeling from 2 of its largest partners withdrawing support. T.O., to the surprise of nearly everyone who expected him to accept a quiet settlement and be done with it, refused. "I don't want his money," he told the board, in a session considerably calmer than the one that had preceded the confidence vote. "I want this handled publicly, transparently, and completely, because the next family this happens to might not have a 7-year-old sharp enough to survive it, and I refuse to let that possibility stay quiet just because it would be more convenient for everyone involved." The story broke nationally within the week. A rival chairman's months-long campaign against a competitor, culminating in an attempt to intimidate a 7-year-old child in an underground parking garage. Baek Joon-ho resigned from his own company's board within the month, facing both criminal charges and a shareholder revolt that made the earlier confidence vote against To look, in hindsight, almost gentle by comparison. Jae-hoon's role in the story, the tip that had, by every reasonable measure, saved Ari from a much worse outcome, became, quietly, its own small piece of grace in the wreckage of his father's downfall. To made sure of it personally, meeting privately with Jae-hoon's mother to guarantee, in writing, that whatever happened to Baek Joon-ho's company, his son would never be made to answer for it, and that a place would remain open for him, in school, in friendship, in whatever future he chose to build regardless of the name attached to his family's collapse. Ari visited him herself, the week after everything settled, finding him sitting alone at recess exactly where she'd first learned his last name meant something. "Everyone knows now," Jae-hoon said, not looking up. "What he did, what I did calling it in. I don't know which part people are going to remember me for." "I know which part I'll remember," Ari said, sitting down beside him without being invited, which she had learned over the past several months was sometimes the kindest thing a person could do. "You called for help when it mattered. You warned me before that more than once at real risk to yourself. Whatever your father did, you are not an extension of him. You're just a boy who did the right thing when it counted, even though it cost you something enormous to do it." Jae-hoon looked at her for a long moment, something loosening in his shoulders that had been tight for months. "You really are the most unsettling person in this entire school." "I've been told," Ari said, and for the first time she smiled at him the way she smiled at very few people, genuine, unguarded, entirely without strategy behind it. "Chess after school? I think you could use a distraction. I think I could too, honestly." "Yeah," Jae-hoon said, something like relief breaking through for the first time in weeks. "Yeah, I'd like that." Part 13, what grew quietly. It was Saren who noticed something wrong first, in the weeks after the worst of the danger had finally passed. A persistent exhaustion she chalked up, for weeks, to stress and late nights, and the general weight of everything that had come before. Until the morning she collapsed in the upstairs hallway, hard enough that To heard the fall from 2 rooms away. She woke in a hospital bed 20 minutes later to her husband's terrified face and her daughter standing at the foot of the bed, uncharacteristically silent, gripping the blanket with white knuckles. "You're awake," To breathed, relief cracking his voice entirely open. "You're awake, thank God." "What happened?" "You collapsed," Ari said, her voice smaller than Saren had heard it since the parking garage. "You've been exhausted for weeks and you kept saying you were fine, and you weren't fine, Mom. And I should have caught it sooner, I catch everything sooner, and I didn't catch this." "Ari," Saren reached for her daughter's hand. "Breathe." The doctor arrived a few minutes later with results that explained everything, and changed the entire shape of the room in an instant. "You're pregnant," she said simply. "About 9 weeks along from the blood work. The exhaustion, the collapse, it's not dangerous, but your body's been running on fumes for months and it finally caught up with you. You need rest. Real rest, not the kind you've apparently been giving yourself." Silence fell over the room, thick and stunned. "Pregnant," To repeated, as though testing whether the word would hold its shape if he said it aloud. "Pregnant," Saren confirmed, her hand finding her stomach almost without her permission, tears rising fast and unstoppable. Ari stood very still at the foot of the bed, processing this with visible effort. "I'm going to have a sibling," she said finally, in the careful, testing tone she used for facts too large to immediately categorize. "You are," To said, laughing through tears of his own now, pulling his daughter close with one arm and reaching for Saren's hand with the other. "Is that all right?" Ari considered the question with more gravity than either parent expected. "I've never had to share strategic authority in this family before," she said slowly. That will require some adjustment on my part. A pause, and then, unexpectedly, her whole careful composure cracked into something bright and unguarded and entirely, purely 7 years old. I'm going to have a sibling, she said again, and this time her voice broke on the words, delighted disbelief chasing away every careful, measured word she'd used for months now. I'm going to teach them chess, and how to negotiate, and how to spot when Dad's about to say something he thinks is a joke but definitely isn't. Hey, Tio protested, laughing. I'm going to be an asterisk older sister asterisk, Ari said, and threw her arms around both her parents at once, hospital bed and all. And for the first time in the entire long ordeal that had started with a woman walking into a lobby claiming a stolen name, the whole family simply held on to each other and cried together, for something joyful instead of something they'd had to survive. Part 14, the ledger's last entry. 6 months later, in a room overlooking the Han River not far from the terrace where her parents had married, Ari Kang held her baby brother for the first time, cradling him with a carefulness that suggested she'd already read several books on the subject, which she had. His name is June, Saren said softly, watching her daughter study the baby's face with the same intense focus she gave everything that mattered to her. What do you think? I think, Ari said slowly, that he has Dad's eyebrows already, which is unfortunate for him, because those eyebrows caused me considerable trouble in negotiations before I learned to control my own expressions. She looked up, and something in her face was softer than her parents had ever seen it. No ledger, no strategy, no careful index cards. Just a 7-year-old girl, entirely undone by love for a person she'd known for 4 minutes. I'm going to protect him, she said quietly. The way you protected me, Mom. The way we all protected each other this whole year. Han Soo-jin, standing by the window with a bouquet she'd brought herself, smiled at that. A woman who'd spent 39 years as a family's best-kept secret, finally standing in a hospital room as an aunt, welcomed, wanted, entirely unhidden. She had, in the months since the board vote, quietly become something none of them had expected. A fixture at family dinners, a steady presence Ari had taken without ceremony to calling simply IMO, aunt, as though the word had always belonged to her. He's lucky, Soo-jin said. Whatever else this family is, it doesn't let its people go easily. Once you're in for good. We fight for each other, T.O. said, an arm around his wife, watching his 2 children with an expression that held every hard year that had led to this one soft moment. We didn't always know how, but we've learned. Min-jun arrived 20 minutes later with a gift bag, entirely too large for a newborn, and a quarterly sourcing report tucked under one arm. For Ari's eventual review, no rush. Followed a moment later by an unexpected addition, Jae-hoon, hovering shyly in the doorway with his mother, holding a small, carefully chosen gift he'd picked out himself. I hope it's all right that we came, his mother said. Jae-hoon insisted. Of course it's all right, Saren said warmly, waving them in. Family isn't only the people you're born connected to. We've learned that lesson rather thoroughly this year. Jae-hoon crossed the room to where Ari sat with her brother, and for a long moment simply looked at the baby with quiet wonder. He's small, he said finally, which made Ari laugh, a real, unguarded laugh, the kind she rarely allowed herself in front of anyone but the people who'd earned it. That's generally how they start, she said. Would you like to meet him properly? June, this is Jae-hoon. He's the reason I got to be here to introduce you at all. The whole extended, complicated, hard-won family filled the small hospital room with noise and laughter, until a nurse gently reminded them visiting hours had rules. Later that night, once the room had emptied and June slept soundly in his mother's arms, Ari sat on the small couch beside her father, her ledger open on her lap for the first time in weeks. What are you writing? Tio asked. Ari considered the blank page for a long moment before finally putting pen to paper. New entry asterisk, she wrote. Status, family secure. Threats, neutralized permanently this time, not just contained, Personnel, one new team member currently unable to speak, walk, or negotiate but showing early promise. One new ally acquired under difficult circumstances, proven trustworthy beyond reasonable doubt. One new aunt fully integrated. Recommendation: enjoy this. Don't wait for the next crisis to notice how good this actually is. She paused, pen hovering, and then added one final line, smaller than the rest, as though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to write it down at all. Also, I was scared in the garage. Genuinely scared, not strategically scared. I am recording this not as a weakness but as a fact because I have decided this year that pretending not to be afraid is not the same thing as being brave. Being brave is being afraid and calling for help anyway. I would like to remember that the next time something happens, because something statistically will happen, but we will be ready. We always are now. She closed the ledger, set it aside, and leaned her head against her father's shoulder. No strategy in it, no calculation, just a tired, happy child at the end of a very long year. Love you, Dad. Love you too, sweetheart, more than any ledger could ever hold. Outside the hospital window, the Han River caught the last of the evening light, the same river that had watched a foam-board bridge become a rooftop kiss, become 8 years of silence, become a bow tie in a hotel lobby, become a family built twice over, first by accident, and then, far more importantly, on purpose, by people who had finally learned to choose each other out loud, again and again, for as long as it took.